Hi everyone, this is Eric Bond, the founder of Beat the GMAT, and welcome to today's webinar, which is called Sell Yourself, How to Showcase Your Talents to the AdCom. So we're delighted to be joined by our co-host for today's webinar, our friends at AcceptU, as well as the co-founder of AcceptU, Marc Zawel. So just a little bit of context, if you haven't heard of AcceptU, this is an elite admissions firm developed by a team of Ivy League admissions officers, so former admissions officers, and they have this amazing track record of having helped hundreds of students since their founding in 2009 to get into the most competitive graduate and MBA programs in the world. And our co-host today, Marc Zawel, is, of course, as I mentioned, the co-founder and CEO of AcceptU. A little bit about his background. So he is the author of a book called Untangling the Ivy League, where Marc literally wrote the book on getting admissions to the highly selected colleges and universities. He is intimately knowledgeable about what it takes to get into these schools, having received a bachelor's from Cornell University as well as an MBA from UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School, where he chaired the admissions advisory board and evaluated application essays. And he's also been responsible for conducting alumni interviews for Cornell since 2004. So in today's session, Marc will be breaking down the key steps in how to sell yourself and provide some concrete tips on how to strategically position your application in order to stand out to the admissions committee. What we're going to do is in a moment, I'm going to hand it off to Marc who will go through his presentation. At the end of his presentation, we're going to ask Marc to stick around for the remaining time to answer your questions. So if you have a question that you'd like to pose to Marc about selling yourself and showcasing yourself to the admissions committee, you can enter your question at any time on the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side of your screen. There should be a chat area where you can enter a question. The Beat the GMAT team will be monitoring the questions coming in, and during the Q&A, I'm going to be coming back online to pose your questions to Marc, and we're going to get through as many as we can for the time that remains. So all that said, Marc, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to hand it off to you right now.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Eric, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. And most importantly, thank you for foregoing the big Apple announcement that's taking place right now. Please don't leave, but appreciate your taking the time to join us this afternoon to learn more about how to sell yourself and how to showcase your talents to the admissions committees at top business schools. I want to just quickly reiterate some of the introduction that Eric just provided. So our group is an MBA admissions counseling group comprised entirely of former admissions officers from top 25 MBA programs. 100% of our counselors have admissions experience, and these counselors provide one-on-one virtual support by phone, Skype, and email that has given hundreds of our clients a competitive advantage and placed them into the business schools of their choice. I don't need to reiterate that flattering introduction from Eric, but I would like to introduce you to my co-founder, Stephen Friedfeld. Stephen and I met over 10 years ago at Cornell University. Stephen has admissions experience both at Cornell University as well as at Princeton University. And our team, as I mentioned, is comprised entirely of former MBA admissions officers from highly selective top 25 programs. We have counselors from Columbia, Cornell, Stanford, Carolina, WashU. Because all these counselors have worked inside of admissions offices, we believe it puts them in a unique position to provide you, the applicants, with inside knowledge and guidance that's needed to differentiate yourselves in this highly competitive process. So to get to today's presentation, we're going to cover three key areas. The first is why gaining admission to selective business schools today rests on your ability to sell yourself. I'm going to talk a little bit about the need for a product customer fit, and I'm also going to talk about the need to build relationships and trust, not just with the business schools themselves, but with admissions officers that are going to be reviewing your applications. Next, I'm going to talk about the 2 ways that you can actively sell yourself during the admissions process. We'll talk a little bit about in your direct interactions with admissions officers and with business schools, as well as in your application materials or in other forms of indirect communication that you have with admissions officers. And then finally, what I've done is I've worked with our team of former MBA admissions officers to come up with 4 concrete tips on how you can sell yourself to admissions officers and to business schools. And we believe that in doing so, give yourself an advantage in being admitted. So to start, we'll go through why the key to gaining admission is the ability to sell yourself. I want to start with the quintessential marketing case study that's used in top business schools around the country. In your introductory marketing course, you'd be hard-pressed not to find a class or an instructor that doesn't use the new Coke example. Now, in the mid-1980s, Coke, which had had a dominant share of the soft drink space since the 60s, started to see its market share rapidly decline. Pepsi, as its competitor, was starting to take away cola drinkers. So Coke management sits down and says, hey, we have to figure out a way to stop losing market share, and in fact, we have to figure out a way to gain more cola drinkers. And so they went out and they conducted some surveys, they conducted some taste tests, and they decided to introduce a new cola formula. And that cola formula was put out into the marketplace, and very quickly a strong vocal group of dedicated Coke drinkers rose up in arms, and they initiated this massive letter writing campaign. They started calling the Coke hotline. There were articles in the local paper. Coca-Cola, which had been called the real thing, was suddenly being called the hypocrite for having changed its formula. And 3 months after new Coke had been introduced, it was pulled from shelves and the old formula was reintroduced. The reason why I wanted to start with that example is because I think it's really important for you to be thinking about a disconnect between marketing and sales and products. Marketing and sales is about matching your product's features to your customer's needs. That's really marketing and sales 101. Your product has to meet a customer's needs. And it sounds basic, but it's really important to consider, especially when you look at the MBA application process. And I want you to think about this in 2 ways. First, as an applicant right now, you are a business school's customers. They are spending millions of dollars trying to sell you on the benefits and the features of their program and encourage you to apply to their program. Now, as soon as you make the conscious decision to apply to that business school, you suddenly are in a much different position. Business schools now become applicants' customers. You have to sell yourself to admissions officers, and so the role actually reverses and flips itself. And whether you're thinking about the first situation or the second situation, fit in admissions is about admitting students that will be satisfied customers. Business schools do not want to admit students and do not want to admit applicants that they do not feel is the right fit for the school. They do not, the reason why they don't do that is because they don't feel like if you are not the right fit, you'll be able to achieve the goals that you've set out to achieve. And unsatisfied customers, meaning if you go to business school and you're not satisfied and you don't see career advancement or career placement or a higher salary or attainable goals that you've set out to achieve at the outset, you'll look unfavorably on that experience. So do not be the new Coke for the business school of your choice, I think is really the key takeaway there. Beyond the product and the market fit and how that relates to the admissions process, I want you to also think about the importance of relationships and trust in terms of sales. Admissions officers want to admit students that will contribute to the diversity of their campus. But admissions officers are also, although it's sometimes hard to believe, they're real people. And they want to admit students that they like. And what that means is they want to admit students that they'll want to interact with on campus. A lot of admissions offices are inside of the business schools. You'll see these admissions officers at lunch. You'll walk past them in the hall. They're a part of that community as much as professors or other folks that are working at these business schools. So they want to, yes, create an atmosphere that's vibrant and diverse and stimulating, but they also want to create an environment that they want to work in. The third thing to think about is admissions officers are completely overwhelmed. If you have been to a business school fair, if you've been to an event where admissions officers are interacting with applicants, you'll see that they are completely swamped and overwhelmed with applicants that are going in front of them and saying, hey, I really am interested in your program. It's difficult for them in their interactions with applicants to differentiate one from another. We're starting to see schools that are proactively reaching out to current students as well as alumni and saying, do you know applicants that you think are a good match for our program? Please refer them to us. And the reason why they're doing that is because a direct referral is a way for a school to pre-screen out applicants. And it's a way for admissions officers to become more focused on the applicants that they feel is the right fit or the right match for the school. Because of all these factors, it's really critical that you start to build relationships with the schools, start to build relationships with the admissions officers who will be reviewing your files, deciding your fate early on. So we've talked a little bit about the need for there to be a product and a market fit. We've talked a little bit about the need to build relationships and trust. So now I want to cover the ways that you can start to do so. In your direct interactions with the admissions committee, you want to start those conversations as early as possible. I know that you all are in various stages of the application process. Some of you are looking to apply in 2 years. Some of you are looking to enter next year. Some of you have just started researching schools. Some of you are completing your essays. But no matter where you are in the process, I think it's important for you to be thinking about the outreach to admissions offices. The reason is that demonstrated interest plays a big factor in admissions decisions. And by demonstrated interest, I mean the contact and the interest that you are expressing in that business school or in that program. Demonstrated interest is an important factor for a couple of reasons. The first is that admissions is a numbers game. There are a certain number of applicants, there are a certain number of offers, and there are a certain number of students that ultimately decide to enroll. And admissions officers can work off of historical data to estimate what each of those numbers looks like, but there is still a lot of uncertainty year to year on what the turnout will actually be like. So the more certainty that applicants can give to admissions officers about their interest in the program and, more importantly, their interest in attending if admitted, the more admissions officers are to look more favorably upon that applicant. If you can make it clear to an admissions officer that this school is of the most interest to you or you would attend if admitted, then that is taken into serious consideration because it starts to remove a lot of the uncertainty around it. And you have to also think that the percentage of students that enroll at a business school who were previously offered a place in the class, which is called the yield, it ties directly into the school's ranking. And yield is considered in many of the top rankings, and so business schools want to see a higher yield, and the way that they can see a higher yield is by admitting students that they believe will attend if they're admitted. What opportunities do you have for direct interaction with these admissions officers? Consider three, I think, of the most impactful ways. The first is by visiting campus. The second is by meeting an admissions officer at a fair or at an outreach event. And then the third is, and the most direct, is through an interview. Okay, so you're meeting an admissions officer, and I think that it's important for you to consider these tips when doing so, because you need to stand out. And I put as the most important tip, make your first impression count. If you're meeting an admissions officer at a fair and there's a group of 20 prospective students standing around that admissions officer and you're waiting patiently in line and you finally get a chance to speak to this admissions officer and you might have 20 or 30 seconds or maybe you have a minute if you're lucky, make that first impression count. You want to be concise and assertive in the way that you're speaking with the admissions officer. Try an icebreaker. These admissions officers are, say at a fair, standing at a table for a couple of hours and having the exact same conversation with applicant after applicant after applicant. If you can create a conversation that is a little bit unique and a little bit different, again, it gives you an opportunity to stand out. You always want to articulate that product and that market fit. You want to explain why you're interested in the school, who you are, and why it's the right fit. You want to practice. You want to be confident in the way that you're speaking with these admissions officers. And as I said earlier, I think that it's really helpful if you try to make the conversation be a conversation and not just a statement of facts. So frequently, applicants will meet an admissions officer and say, hi, this is my name, this is where I did my undergrad, this is my GMAT score, this is the number of years of work experience that I have, and can you tell me some more about your school? Try to make it a conversation. Show that you have done your research. Show that you understand why the program is a good fit given your interest. And try to pose questions to the admissions officer. And make sure that those questions that you're posing to the admissions officer are not questions that you could get the answer to simply by going to the school's website. The good questions to ask admissions officers can be opinion-based, because an opinion-based question is not something that you would be able to find independently. So I think that questions where an admissions officer is asked his or her opinion, like, why did you decide to, or what do you like most about this business school? What do you like most about working at this business school? That type of question shows an interest in the school, but it also gives an admissions officer some time to talk a little bit more about themselves. And we all love to talk about ourselves. So you want to be courteous. I've been to fairs where applicants have monopolized time with an admissions officer. It's not fair to the admissions officer, and it's certainly not fair to the other applicants. And you can be sure that an admissions officer is not just picking up on what you are saying when you are speaking to him or her. An admissions officer is picking up on your interaction with others. And they're picking up on a lot of cues. And ultimately, what you say to the admissions officer is likely not going to be what they remember. They're going to remember their first impression of you and the interactions that you had with them and others. So keep that in mind. Be your own advocate. It goes, and it's worth repeating. The most important thing for you to be doing is talking about yourself and your interest in the school and why that school is the right fit for you. Again, I keep going back to these fairs, but if say you're also at an event that's being held with alumni or current students and a few admissions officers at a hotel ballroom, you also want to be visible in your interactions with others. You might be standing in a group with 8 or 10 prospective students with one admissions officer there. And you want to be visible in those interactions, but you really cannot be overbearing. There's probably nothing worse than to be overbearing or monopolizing of the situation and the time, because I think it's disrespectful both to the admissions officer as well as to those applicants that are there with you. And then the last tip is also really important, and it does happen frequently, but I thought it was worth just putting down. You want to get the admissions officer's business card so that you can follow up. And we'll talk a little bit about how you follow up and indirect contact that you can have with an admissions officer in just a slide or two. So in your indirect interactions, indirect interactions are simply those that are not face-to-face. They can be an email exchange, they can be a phone call, they can be in your essays or other written application materials. They can be a written note that you use to follow up with an admissions officer after having met with him or her. Indirect actions can either be independent or they can be reinforcing of your direct interaction. So a written note, for example, that would be a follow-up to a direct interaction that you had with an admissions officer, while perhaps an email exchange with an admissions officer that you have not previously met would be something that's independent. You don't want to force indirect interactions. There's no point in initiating contact with an admissions office simply to initiate contact with an admissions office. It's a waste of time for you. It's a waste of time for admissions officers. They can see right through it, and you really should limit your indirect interactions to those that are meaningful and purposeful. The last point I want to make about indirect versus direct interactions is you need to be cognizant of your indirect interactions. You're losing that face-to-face interaction. And there's a lot of benefit to direct or personal interaction. There's body language, there's different cues that you can pick up on. You lose all of that through an indirect interaction, and because of that, the way that you approach your indirect interactions with the admissions committee or with an admissions officer is slightly different. When you are indirectly interacting with the admissions committee and indirectly interacting would comprise an email exchange or a phone call or even in your application materials and your essays themselves, here's some tips that I like to encourage applicants to consider. The first is that you want to stay professional. It's particularly easy with emails to become a little bit more casual. To send an email that said, "Hey Mark, it was great meeting you last night at the admissions event. Let's keep in touch. Best, your name." And you lose a lot of that professionalism when you don't write in a more structured way. So just be careful, especially in your email correspondence with admissions officers, that you stay professional. Imagine you're writing to your boss or your supervisor, and you should be writing to admissions officers in the exact same way. Be careful with any humor. In your essays, on a phone call with an admissions officer, you don't have those types of body cues, and it can be easy for humor to become misconstrued or misrepresented, and there's probably nothing more awkward than that. You want to stay focused and you want to stay on point. You don't want to send an admissions officer a thesis on how great it was to meet them and how you're really looking forward to applying to their program. Keep it short, keep it sweet, and get to the point. Use examples whenever possible. If you're working on your essays, you of course know this. But you could also use examples in other indirect forms of interaction, whether it's in an email or otherwise. You want to also, before you send anything in, and for your essays, for emails, read aloud what you are about to send and make sure that the tone is appropriate. Is there something that could be misconstrued? Always try to convey why the program is the right match. I'm going to say this again and again over the course of this presentation because it is so critical that you demonstrate the match. If you cannot demonstrate the match, it's very, very difficult to be admitted to these schools. You also want to listen. I've been on calls with applicants where they'll just talk and talk and talk, and there's not even an opportunity for me to get in my 2 cents. So make sure that you are having conversations with admissions officers in a way that are more interactive. The last two follow instructions. It goes without saying, but it's amazing how many applicants don't follow just the basic instructions, and this is applying primarily to the essays. And then the last is to be likable. Going back to one of the first slides that we covered, admissions officers are people, and they are admitting students that they want to have on their campus. You want to be someone that they like, and you want to convey that likability in your essays. You want to convey that likability on phone calls or in interviews or in email correspondence. Be someone that they want to have on their campus. Especially for highly competitive programs, standardized test scores, work experience, undergraduate GPA, many of those factors are almost a given. And so the way that admissions officers are making decisions about applicants is by looking at who these applicants are, what makes them interesting, what makes them unique, and whether they're people that they would like. And it can sound vain or superficial, but at the end of the day, admissions officers admit students that they like. So we've gone through why the key to gaining admission is about product and customer fit and about building relationships and trust. We've also talked about the two ways, both direct and indirect, that you can sell yourself to the admissions officers and to the admissions office during the process. Now I want to go through the 4 tips that my team of former MBA admissions officers has put together. We wanted these to be concrete tips because we want you to walk away from this webinar today with something that you feel is tangible and something that you can use. So the 4 tips, we'll start with admissions officers are judging your potential, not your achievement. The second tip ties into something that we've already talked about, which is you need to target your selling and match your skills based on your audience. We're going to talk a little bit about leadership and its importance in terms of the qualities that admissions officers are looking to identify in applicants. And then finally, we're going to talk about imperfection. And so many applicants are worried and concerned that they aren't perfect and that there are applicants that are. And the reality is that none of us are, and admissions officers value imperfection in applicants. So let's start with admissions officers judging potential versus achievement. And I want to draw on this study that came out of Stanford because I thought it was so interesting. And what they did is they asked participants in this study if they would prefer to buy a piece of art from a well-respected current artist or from an artist who was said to be the next big thing. They also asked participants if they would rather eat dinner at a restaurant with a career chef or at a restaurant whose chef was recently voted an up-and-coming star. Finally, they asked participants if they would prefer to see a stand-up comedian who, quote, everybody's talking about, or a stand-up comedian who in a year everybody could be talking about. And so think for a little bit about how you would reply. And I'll flip to the next slide because consistently the participants in this study all favored the latter. They all wanted the next big thing. They all wanted they wanted the up-and-coming star. They wanted to really push potential over achievement, which doesn't really make sense if you think about it. But the reality is that potential is less certain. It's difficult for you to judge potential. Achievement is much more concrete. You can judge achievement based on what someone has done in the past. Potential, you don't really have much to go on in terms of trying to determine whether someone or something has potential. What's really interesting about this study, though, is that we spend more time analyzing and trying to understand less certain situations. When situations are less certain, our brains require more processing. And the more processing that our brains have trying to understand a situation, the more favorable opinion we have. So now you're all saying, what are we talking about? I thought I was on a webinar trying to figure out how to get into business school. So let's tie this into admissions. You need to balance highlighting your past strengths with demonstrating to admissions officers your potential. We know that if you're talking and emphasizing your potential, they're going to be spending more time trying to understand you and more time evaluating your application. And the reality is you can spend hours, days, weeks, or months working on your application materials and your essays, but admissions officers blaze through the review process. And any additional time that you can gain capturing an admissions officer's interest will certainly benefit you. And so if we know that understanding potential takes more time than understanding past achievement, then think about the impact that that has with your application materials. Show admissions officers how an MBA from their program will help accelerate your skills, your experience. You want to show them how it'll allow you to achieve your full potential. If admissions officers are successful in identifying applicants with potential, think about the ramifications, both short-term as well as long-term. In the short term, you're going to have more dynamic learning environments, but in the longer term, you're going to have something that will benefit the program in that successful alumni are also generous alumni, and admissions officers want to admit students that they see have the potential for success, and that success will in turn give itself back to that program. So now, if you're sitting there and saying, what if I don't have achievement? What if I don't think that I have any potential? Well, if you don't feel like you have a lot of past achievement, that's okay. Emphasize the potential impact that you can have. And if you do have a lot of achievement to draw back on, then you'll want to highlight that achievement, but you'll also want to ensure that you're discussing the future potential that you have both in the business school as well as in your short-term and in your long-term career. The second tip I want to discuss is really boiling down into this concept of the need to target your selling based on your audience. We've talked about this several times now, and if you remember nothing else from this presentation today, please remember this. You need to base your application, base your contact with an understanding of what admissions officers are looking for. We've talked about admissions officers are real people, and business schools are businesses, and students are customers. You need to make sure that the program and the resources that are available will really help you achieve your career goals. So frequently, my team works with clients that say, I want to go to a top 25 or top 20 business school, and here are my qualifications. And the first question that we'll always ask is, well, what do you want to do? There needs to be reasonable expectations in terms of your short-term and your long-term career goals, but there also needs to be reasonable expectations in terms of whether your MBA is going to help you achieve those goals. And that's what it really comes down to from an admissions standpoint. Admissions officers don't want to admit students that have unreasonable expectations about what they will be able to achieve after they have graduated from the program. If you have unreasonable expectations or a misaligned program, you're going to ultimately have unhappy graduates. You're going to have lower giving. There's going to be an impact on rankings and reputation. Another factor besides yield that's taken into consideration by many business schools' rankings is the percentage of graduates that have full-time employment after graduation. So it all starts to tie together. Think about business school as the bridge between what you're doing today and what you want to be doing after graduation. And make sure that in your application materials, you're clearly communicating why business school and how business school is going to act as that bridge. Let's reiterate some of these additional tips that fall under that second tip. But Most importantly, apply to schools that have the right programs. You cannot fake interest in a school. If you're interested in finance and the school doesn't offer a finance concentration, then you shouldn't be applying there. And it sounds obvious, but it happens so frequently. And admissions officers will see right through it, and you'll be rejected. You need to emphasize how the school's programs, and the school's programs can be academic courses, they can be extracurricular activities, they can be professors, they can be a school's location, they can be a school's alumni network, they can be career services. Whatever it is about that school's program will help you achieve your career goals. You want to really actively research schools to find the match. If you can't articulate that match, and the match is how that business school is going to help you achieve your future career goal, you need to either evolve your career goal so that the business school does have the resources and the programs to support it, or better yet, you should not apply to that business school. We get a question from our clients frequently about, what if my career goal isn't really supported at the school, but I'm still really interested in that school? For example, if you want to study entrepreneurship, which may or may not be offered by a school that you're interested in, you need to understand that if you're interested in something that not a lot of other applicants are interested in, it can both help you and it can hurt you in the process. It can help you because if you're interested in an area that fewer applicants are interested in, you can stand out. You become someone that's a little bit different. But it can also raise a lot of red flags, especially when it comes to career placement. If you're interested in going to business school to study entrepreneurship, most business schools will immediately red flag your application because there's going to be a concern about whether you'll be able to find a job after you graduate. You don't have entrepreneurial on-campus recruiting, typically. A school like Harvard Business School, they do actually have a startup career fair. But most schools have very limited resources when it comes to supporting students that are interested in non-traditional areas. So the way that you need to address that is proactively. You need to, in your application materials, acknowledge that the area that you're interested in is somewhat different and is somewhat unique, and that you understand what you will have to undertake in order to find a job or find a career in that area. Third, let's talk about leadership. It's hard to go to an information session today. It's hard to go to a business school's website today without seeing leadership in big, bold letters. What it comes down to is admissions officers want to identify leaders, and of course they want to identify potential leaders. If you are a leader today, that's great. Don't be shy about it, and show admissions officers in your direct and in your indirect contact with them how you have been a leader. But also be careful about going too far in terms of showing them why you are a leader and what you have done to be a leader. If you aren't a leader today, that's okay. Leadership isn't necessarily about what you have done to date. It can be about what you've been able to achieve with the help of others, or what others have been able to achieve because of you. So there's a very broad definition of what leadership is. Leadership can be, but it's not necessarily managing. And so many applicants confuse and mix up the two. Here's an example that I wanted to just present to you all. With about 2 applicants. One who has the responsibility of managing a team of 5 employees. He's a consultant working with IBM as his client. He's keeping his colleagues on task. He's really managing the entire engagement, and he's delivering a project 2 weeks ahead of deadline. And then we have another applicant who works at GM and sees some of her coworkers huddled in the break room around the water cooler, and there's concern that job security is an issue after a recent round of layoffs. And what she does is she talks with her coworkers, she addresses their concerns, and she ensures that that type of sentiment around job security doesn't impact performance or productivity. So which of these applicants is a leader? And the answer is both. What qualities are representative of a leader? You need to consider both personal as well as professional leadership. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the office. Those two examples are corporate leadership examples, but leadership in your application materials or leadership as an example that you're presenting to the admissions office does not necessarily need to be a work leadership example. Consider, have you worked with others? Have you set a vision? Have you achieved results? Have you mentored others? Have you listened to others? Have you motivated others? Have you compromised? Have you boosted morale during a difficult time? If so, you are a leader. And I'm willing to bet that every single one of you out there right now can answer yes to at least one of those questions. So with leadership, it's about making sure that you broaden the definition if you need to and presenting your leadership in a way that's going to be impactful in your application materials. Let's get to the fourth tip. Acknowledge that you're not perfect. Business schools do not necessarily admit well-rounded students. It's a common misconception, actually, and we see it a lot with the clients that we work with. They say, well, I don't really have any volunteer experience, or I'm kind of weak on my work experience, or my work experience has been really focused and not diverse. Business schools are building well-rounded classes. They don't necessarily need to admit well-rounded students. If you're a well-rounded student, that's great, but if you're not, it doesn't really matter because you just need to fill a niche within that well-rounded class. Step back and try to stereotype yourself a little bit. Who are you? What role will you play in this class? What are your strengths? What can you leverage that's a little bit different that will contribute to this dynamic learning environment? Understand well who you are and where you fall. And then make sure you talk about that diversity and those unique perspectives that you can lend in your interactions with admissions officers. No one is perfect. Business school applicants are not perfect. Admissions officers are not perfect. Don't try to pretend that you are perfect. Instead, what you really should try to do is acknowledge your faults and show growth. It's all about growth, and it's all about showing how you have learned from past experiences, even if those past experiences have been negative. Why does the admissions committee like imperfect applicants? Mistakes and challenges allow you to demonstrate certain qualities and characteristics to admissions officers. Humility, honesty, introspection, even vulnerability, a willingness to change and grow and mature. And most importantly, being imperfect shows admissions officers that you are real. And it all comes down to likability. Admissions officers want to admit real people, people that they like, people that they want to interact with. And if we're not all perfect, it's okay that you're not perfect in your application materials. So to wrap up, today we discussed why the key to gaining admission rests on your ability to sell yourself. We talked about the product customer fit, and we used New Coke as an example. We talked a lot about building relationships and trust with admissions officers. We also talked about the two ways that you can sell yourself during the admissions process, both in your direct interactions as well as in your indirect interactions with admissions officers. And then we wrapped up with 4 tips on how to sell yourself, taking advice that my team here at AcceptU of former admissions officers has gained from having reviewed thousands of applications. So that's the presentation, and I want to take some time now to answer questions that have been streaming in over the course of the last 45 minutes or so.
Wonderful. Well, for those of you who might have joined us a little bit late, we've been hearing Marc Zawel, who is the co-founder of AcceptU, to walk through this great presentation called Sell Yourself, How to Showcase Your Talents to the AdCom. And as Marc had indicated, we're now ready to take your questions. So if you want to ask a question to Marc, you can do so by entering your question into the chat area on this GoToWebinar platform. And our team will be reviewing the questions, and I'll be asking your questions one by one to Marc, and we'll try to get through as many as we can for, let's say, the next 12 minutes that we have available for today's session. So, Marc, the first question comes from Nikhil. Nikhil's asking, how do we international applicants who cannot visit the campus make an impact with admissions committee?
So I think that's first of all, a great question. If you can't have that type of direct interaction with an admissions officer, then consider those ways that you can have an indirect conversation with them. Now, depending on where you are in the world, business schools are doing a lot of global outreach, and they are sending admissions officers on the road to major cities and regions in order to recruit international students. So if you have an admissions officer or an MBA fair in your region, I would strongly encourage you to attend that fair or attend that event so that you can have one point of direct interaction with an admissions officer, so that you can have that one strong contact. You can build that rapport and build that relationship. Now, if you're in a part of the world where there is no admissions officers coming, then you have to rely on more of the indirect forms. And what you'll want to do is identify which admissions officer at the program or programs that you're interested in is responsible for your region. And admissions officers generally divide up applicants based on geography. And so who is the admissions officer that's going to be reviewing your application? And even if it's as simple as sending that admissions officer a quick email that says, "Hi, I just wanted to let you know I'm very interested in the program, and you should be expecting my application shortly," and maybe even posing a question or two to start to build that relationship through email, that I think is a benefit. Because most applicants are not doing that. They're just submitting their application materials, and an admissions officer is sitting down and saying, "Okay, how do I compare this applicant to another," as opposed to, "Oh, I think that I've gotten emails from this applicant, and this is someone that seems really interested in my program."
Thank you, Marc. I see another question coming in from Andrew. Andrew wants to get a little bit more detail about the best ways to research the strengths of your target schools. So what resources should applicants look through? Is it primarily the website? Any other thoughts on that?
Your best resource are the current students there. And we advise our clients when they start to refine their school list to initiate outreach to current students as well as to others that are on campus. So think about this. If you contact an admissions office and say, "Hi, I'm interested in finance. Can you connect me with a current student at the school that has a similar interest?" That student is a great resource for you to turn to. Now, if you call the admissions office and they say, "Sorry, we don't have that type of resource available," then jump onto the school's website and find the student that runs the finance club at that school and contact him or her directly. You might also consider contacting a professor at the school, not necessarily the head of the finance department, but maybe there's a professor that teaches a course that you find particularly interesting. It's about researching the school to make sure that it's the right fit, but a side benefit of that type of outreach and that type of work is that you can then reference that outreach in your application materials. You can say, "In my conversation with this professor, I've really realized that this program in terms of its finance offerings is the right fit." Or in my conversations with this current student or this alumnus, my feelings have been reinforced in terms of why school X is right for me. So the best resource you have are the students and the faculty and the administrators that are on campus. The school website is great, it's there, but that's what most applicants are using when it comes to researching schools. You need to go above and beyond in terms of researching the program, not just because it'll help you then build a stronger argument as to why that school's the right fit, but so that you can then in turn use that type of outreach in your application materials to show admissions officers directly what you have done to understand that that school is the right fit for you.
Mark, I have my follow-up question to what you just said too. So what are your thoughts about name dropping? You provided a couple examples of, let's say I meet with student Susan, and I say like, oh, when I was speaking to Susan about XYZ in my application, do you have any thoughts about citing specific names? I'd love to hear a little bit more detail on that.
So with our clients, we do encourage them to use that. So if you talk to a current student, you can reference that student in your application essay. Now, there's of course limits. You can't have 18 different students that you've talked to. You have to use some discretion there, but it's okay for you to actually reference specific individuals that you have spoken to. I think it lends credibility to your argument that you have done your due diligence and that you have done your research on that specific program. Of course, use some discretion. You don't want to go over the top or overboard with that type of outreach, but it's something that I think and that our counselors believe allows applicants to differentiate themselves and sell themselves in a way that's much more effective than a more passive approach.
Yeah, completely agree. Next question here is from Lisa. So Lisa is asking, what's the best way to explain an unemployment gap or employment gap, especially if you've been volunteering and interning while looking for a full-time position?
I don't, it's so, you see so frequently applicants stressing about how to explain discrepancies in their application, and the reality is that if you can explain it in a thoughtful way, it's something that is overlooked by the admissions office. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're seeking a job and you've been unemployed for a month or 6 months, or you've been unemployed for a year, let's remember admissions officers are human beings. They live in the same world that we live in, and they understand the economic environment in which we're all living right now. Now, the best way to describe it to an admissions officer is, or in your application materials more generally, is talk about how you have been spending your time. And I think depending on how long you have been unemployed, there gets to be a point where you want to be showing that you are doing something beyond just actively job searching. Your full-time job for a certain period of time can be actively seeking work, but if you've been looking for a job for 6 months or you've been looking for a job for longer than that, try to get yourself involved in some other activities, and that's not necessarily only going to benefit you with an MBA application, but it's also going to benefit you in terms of your job search as well. So don't worry about discrepancies in your application if they can be clearly communicated and explained to the admissions office, and the way that you explain it is by showing them what you have done. And I don't think that it's something that raises a real red flag, because admissions officers are people and they understand the world that we're living in today.
Yeah, I think that's a really great perspective, Mark. And Lisa, just to provide a little bit of my own commentary, I have a very good friend who recently graduated from MIT Sloan, and he just started at McKinsey. But leading up to the day that he submitted his MIT Sloan application, he was unemployed for an entire year. And what he did during that time was some exceptionally interesting travel throughout the world, and had a lot of really good, I guess, personal life growth during that 1 year. So I think he was able to transform that gap in employment into a real advantage for him ultimately in his application. So it does happen. Okay. So I see we have maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions, Mark. This next question is actually specifically about AcceptU from Angie. Does AcceptU offer services for consortium applications? I'm interested if they do this.
We do. So we offer, and I would encourage those of you that are still on and interested to visit our website, AcceptU.com. And we've also, we're offering all of you who have attended the webinar today a complimentary admissions assessment with one of our former MBA admissions officers, and the link is up on your screen now. And then I also just want to briefly mention that if you're interested in a copy of this presentation, because I know that we covered a lot of ground, you can just visit that link, which is also up on your screens now, and you'll be able to download a copy.
Fantastic. Let's see if we can take one more question with the time remaining here. So another AcceptU question: Does AcceptU do you have a Facebook page that our members can follow as well?
We do. If you go to AcceptU.com, you'll see links to both our Facebook as well as to our Twitter accounts, and we pretty actively manage those. We are putting out a lot of information, both in terms of tips and best practices that we're finding online, as well as the content that's being published by our counselors. So please like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. And hopefully the content that we're putting out there will be beneficial and helpful to you in the application process.
Thank you so much. So we've been listening and speaking to Marc Zawel, who is the co-founder and CEO of AcceptU, which is a top MBA admissions consulting firm and a top admissions consulting firm in general, comprised entirely of former admissions officers from the world's most competitive higher education programs. And Marc walked us through a number of great tips and advice on how you can showcase your talents and sell yourself effectively to admissions committee. And for the last 15 minutes or so, Marc has also been answering your questions directly live. Marc, just thank you so much for preparing this presentation and spending your time with us. This has been a really fantastic webinar today.
Thanks all for joining.
Great. And just to reiterate a couple items that Marc had mentioned, we do have Marc is offering all of our webinar attendees a complimentary admissions assessment from one of their staff members, a former admissions officer. So you can get some feedback about your own candidacy, about your strengths and weaknesses, and some recommendations for improving. Sign up by going to learnmore.acceptu.com/webinar. And also the presentation is available for download, as Marc said, at learnmore.acceptu.com/sell. So if you couldn't write that all down quickly enough, we're going to send a follow-up email with this information, so you'll be able to click and refer to that link. And before we conclude, Marc, I just want to send you one piece of feedback from Anthony, who is a listener. He said, Marc, I've listened to a lot of webinars, and this one was great. Very insightful and motivating. Thank you. And I'm sure that Anthony speaks for many of us in the audience today.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, well, with that, we're going to close for today's session, and we look forward to hosting future events with Marc as well as the AcceptU team. And just look out for our follow-ups via email, and definitely check out acceptu.com after this session. So thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon. All the best, guys.